Hey guys, welcome to the channel. This is the Red Shadow, and I'm a bit late on doing this video, but just felt like it would be remiss for me not to say a little something about the passing of Scott Hall, aka Razor Ramon, aka a bunch of other characters and whatnot over his years, many years in the professional wrestling business. The reason why his passing struck me a little more powerfully than some other wrestlers, and there have been a lot of wrestlers who've passed over the years way too young. Scott Hall, I believe, was 63 when he passed. The reason why his death really struck me more so was because he was basically my first true favorite wrestler. As a kid in the 80s, I loved, all the big names that you would think about: Hogan and Andre the Giant and Macho Man Randy Savage and Junkyard Dog, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. Like, I was a WWF kid, and I knew who wrestlers like Ric Flair and Sting and Arn Anderson, Four Horsemen, those kind of guys. I knew who those people were, but I was drawn to the colorful, cartoony, over-the-top gimmicks of the WWF back in the 80s, loud and brass and rock and roll and wrestling, and but when I graduated high school in 1992 and I moved out on my own around that same time frame, and I was sort of like, I controlled the clicker. I got to watch whatever I wanted to watch whenever I wanted to watch it, and I watched wrestling and was familiar at least with wrestling. I fell off on watching wrestling in those years, but there was this one guy who sort of broke through all that for me. Just cool, the machismo, the swagger, the interesting accent, the way he dressed, the way he looked, and that was Razor Ramon. This guy who was based off of, I believe, who was it? Tony, how do you pronounce it? Tony Montana from Scarface. And I'm sure there were other inspirations involved there. But he, had a toothpick in his mouth, and he called everybody Chico, and he would take the toothpick out and throw it at the camera or throw it in the face of his opponents when he was wrestling. There was just something about that. It was so different than 5 or 10 years before, when it was just these big muscle guys that were posing, and then you had Repo Man, the Repo Mans, and the Duke the Dumpster Drozy, and Doink the Clown, and all this kind of nonsense that bloomed out of that time in what would become a very, very dead and flat time for the company. It was guys like Razor Ramon, aka Scott Hall, who sort of rose to the top, and I just kind of latched on to him. Like I said, I didn't watch the product a whole lot at that time, and yet he still stood out. And when I did come back and get into wrestling, sadly, he was gone from the WWF. He had jumped ship with Kevin Nash, aka Diesel, in WWF in the 90s. Another wrestler that I really liked, but Hall was just like the guy for me. He was the bad guy. They had jumped ship and went to WCW in what was a very innovative program at the time, playing a couple of guys who looked like they'd come from the company up north to the company down south and were going to take over, blurring that line, breaking the fourth wall, being meta, being sort of pointing at the smart fans and saying, hey, we recognize you. And so in 97-ish, I'd say, maybe late 96, but 97, I'd sort of gotten back into watching Raw and pay-per-views, and when I saw, what Nash and Hall were doing as the outsiders, and then eventually NWO, I brought about the only piece of WWE merchandise or whatever that I have that has Scott Hall on it. He's right there on the back. This is the Nwo Blu-Ray. When the NWO became this big thing in WCW, as a wrestling fan and somebody who was early on the internet, and the internet wrestling community was talking about all this behind-the-scenes stuff, and everybody was always talking about NWO. They were always talking about how it was sort of a thing that was making WCW really hot, and they became kind of a juggernaut in the ratings that took a Stone Cold and a Vince McMahon to flip that back over to their side. A storyline like the NWO and a lot of the stuff that ECW was doing, where they were really pushing the envelope and being edgy and mature, it's kind of what, in my opinion, righted the ship for the WWF, because they were still too cartoony and too cheesy and cornball for people. And when the company grew up in the 90s, a time when myself and my generation was growing up, it was great. It was an amazing time in wrestling, and I feel like guys like Hall and Nash were kind of at the forefront of that. And if you've ever seen anything about them behind the scenes in their interviews and stuff like that, they're so into that breaking the fourth wall meta stuff that they were the right people to do to make that move and to be a part of that gimmick, even though the NWO thing kind of collapsed in on itself over the years. I would watch and listen and read about that stuff and think, gosh, I wish Razor was back. I wish Scott Hall was back. Eventually he would come back. WCW was bought out by Vince McMahon, and eventually the NWO was brought to WWF/E, and it didn't really go anywhere and didn't really do anything, but it was cool to have Scott back on the program for a while. And Scott had a lot of problems back in those days. It goes all the way back to an issue when he was younger, when there was a fight and a gun went off and the other person died. I don't know what to call it because I don't have the details specifically in front of me. But he went through some troubling times. He had an alcohol problem and I believe drugs. And there's a lot of examples of him being at shows inebriated, under the influence, definitely. And he had a lot of struggles that he went through and hit some deep low points. But turned things around with big help from, WWE, I think, paid for a lot of rehabilitation that he had. I think his true turning point was with DDP and DDP Yoga and going to the accountability house of Diamond Dallas Page and being there at the time when Jake the Snake Roberts was there. Changed a lot of things in his life and did better. And it's unfortunate that his passing, because it came due to him having, I believe it was hip surgery, and during the procedure, I read that a blood clot came loose and he suffered a couple of heart attacks. And there for a little while it looked like he might survive, but I worried a lot about what state he was going to be in, because, multiple heart attacks or strokes in those kind of situations when you're older like that, usually it's not good. But sadly and ultimately, he passed away from it. And it was one of the first times in a while, especially with a performer in professional wrestling, their passing made me emotional. I struggled for a while. I kept reading stuff and articles about it and reading what people were saying on social media, and it just really got to me. Maybe it was better that I waited a little while to do this, but I knew I had to sit down and talk about Razor Ramon, Scott Hall, and I wanted to kind of like cap this off. I just wanted to state what would be my Mount Rushmore of wrestling stars, and I'm not limiting it to just 4 because I just couldn't. It's for me, it's 6. These are not my choices for the best wrestlers ever. They're my personal favorite wrestlers from over the years, basically since I've been, late teens or 20s. So we're talking like close to 30 years. These are the wrestlers that made the biggest impression on me, that I enjoyed watching wrestle. I enjoyed watching, cutting promos, their mic work, their, goofy sketches and comedy and all that, or their seriousness stood out from all the rest for me. And I doing this basically in chronological order of when I sort of adopted them as my favorites. So, of course, Razor Ramon, I mentioned it earlier, was basically my first favorite wrestler. The next person who would have came up in that for me would have been, I believe, Edge. When he first came to WWE, it was very enigmatic, mysterious, even when he was just by himself, and then eventually they introduced Christian as his brother, and then he was a part of the Brood with Christian and Gangrel, and then eventually he and Christian as a tag team became sort of like a comedy act, and then he went solo and he did a lot of stuff there. That was when he became a little bit more of a serious contender, a serious threat, and a more all-around performer. Edge, I just really enjoyed everything from his look to his wrestling to his many different gimmicks and heel and face turns. So it'd be Razor Ramon and then Edge, and then I think I would put Kane in there next. Some of the earliest days of Kane, basically from Kane's debut up until around the time of the unmasking, I thought Kane was just a juggernaut. I loved this dark, quiet, like mysterious, doesn't speak type of character. And it didn't even matter to me that the storyline was that he was the Undertaker's brother. That aspect of it never really meant anything to me. They did stuff with that, and then they didn't. And then Kane ran solo and had nothing to do with the Undertaker. And then they would come back and they'd be a tag team or whatever. After the unmasking, I think things went a little wonky. Sometimes that period of Kane's career was good, and sometimes it was embarrassing. But for those first few years, Kane was up there, and I always imagined that's the birth point of my name, the Red Shadow. I've been using online for more than 20 years. The Red Shadow was this wrestler who was going to be a part of the Brood with Edge, Christian, Gangrel, Kane, who I thought would have made a great addition to the Brood, and then this character, the Red Shadow, was going to be the 5th of the group. That's just how much I loved Kane and Edge back in those days. I thought they could have been a part of their own, like additions to, or not. Edge was in the Brood. Kane would have been an addition to the Brood, and then I liked the idea of the character that I created that was going to be a part of the group. So that's the first 3. Razor, Edge, Kane. Then came Kurt Angle. Kurt Angle, I loved. Great wrestler. Amazing wrestler. Amazing that somebody who came from legit wrestling came to professional wrestling and did so well, so fast, and in honestly so short a period of time, because I think he only really wrestled for WWE for like 6 years and then spent more time in TNA than he did in WWE, even though he came back to the WWE and went to the Hall of Fame, wrestled here and there, but he wasn't like a full-time performer when he came back 5 or 6 years ago, whenever it was. But that 6 years or so that Kurt Angle was champion and wrestling against the likes of Jericho and Triple H and The Rock and Stone Cold, that was an amazing time. Kurt Angle was so good at being both a heel and a face. It's just a perfect compliment to any wrestler, is that they can excel at both sides of it, and Kurt definitely did. So Kurt gets a spot on my Mount Rushmore. I fell out of wrestling around 2007 or so and didn't really pay much attention to it for a few years, but there was a guy who was coming up in that time. He'd been in ECW and then was in WWE. He was even a part of the WWE CW, but really blossomed once he got on main TV, and that was CM Punk. Still one of my all-time favorite wrestlers. Still love such a unique personality, kind of a guy who just doesn't give any fucks, both behind the scenes and on screen. Is a good wrestler. I feel like I haven't really seen his best work, though. Some of his pay-per-view matches in WWE were pretty fantastic, and he could have a great match with so many guys. But because I was out of wrestling for a lot of that time, I missed a lot of the best. At least I have his Blu-ray as well. Loved his kind of like long hair, beard, Manson time, and then he cut his hair short and slicked it back, and like he was a guy who could do subtle things with his hair and his wrestling gear and sort of feel fresh again. So miss him. I'm glad for him that he's in AEW doing his thing again. Wish he could have come back to WWE, but there's such bad blood going on over there between him and some of the higher ups whose last names include McMahon in them. So all good for him. He'll always be a part of my Mount Rushmore. And then the last one, who came to WWE in 2017, I believe it was, after a long career in other companies, TNA, for example, that's AJ Styles. Another guy who wrestles crazily, but is good on the mic, has these cocky characters that he does, but mainly just takes care of things in the ring, and I just love it. I also wish that I had been a more frequent viewer of the product. AJ Styles was enough to bring me back to watching wrestling there for a while, paying for the WWE Network before that went away. Love to see him in some big technical showcase matches and pay-per-views. But I couldn't just watch pay-per-views only. If I could have watched Raw and SmackDown all the time, I would have been so much happier to see AJ's time in the company. And yeah, he would round out my Mount Rushmore of wrestlers that I love and have loved over the years. So anyway, just one last rest in peace, Scott Hall. Thank you for the memories. Thank you for shocking the world with that little walk down the stairs into the WCW arena. And I want to do my impression of the you know who I am, but you don't know why I'm here. Fantastic opening line of his WCW debut when people had no idea what was going on and why he was there. Those are great memories I'll always have. So, like I said, rest in peace, Scott Hall. Thank you for entertaining me for so many years. Alright guys, that's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.